I tell you, it's been an exciting 3 years with TPG Rise Climate. So for as far back as I almost can remember, I was focused on the environment and conservation. While I was at Goldman Sachs, I chaired a couple of conservation NGOs, the National Board of the Nature Conservancy and the Peregrine Fund. I think it was in the late 90s that I became increasingly concerned about the growing climate threat. And then when I was Treasury Secretary, I did a deep dive on the economic impact of climate. And when I left Treasury, I started several NGOs. I got involved in a couple starting initiatives where the focus on all of them was the environment and to a large extent, climate change. And to me, everything I did, all of the early work involved CEOs, right, and the private sector. And so, I had a big focus. But then it was hearing from John Wakefield, who I'd worked with for many years at Goldman Sachs, and Jim Coulter, who I'd admired for a long time. And they came to me with the idea of the TPG Rise Climate Fund. And I had no intention of going to work full time on this or even part time, but I said I would help them think it through. And as I started to think it through, there were two factors that drew me really to return to my roots in finance. One of them, which was clearly that the market had changed in a way that there was a more favorable opportunity for investing in climate solutions. And then secondly, there are some very favorable, attractive aspects about TPG that drew me to the firm. But let me get to the market first. All of us who had been studying climate knew it was going to take massive amounts of capital to go through this decarbonization, and that the governments wouldn't have it, would have to come from the private sector, and the private sector capital wouldn't be there in the quantities you needed it unless it generated an attractive return on capital. And so the first thing that I saw when I began to do some of my thinking and strategize with Jim and the team about TPG Rise Climate was that, first of all, TPG had begun to prove the case. At the Rise Fund, they had made a number of investments which really intrigued me, number one. And then when I went and began to talk with CEOs to get their views, I could see that the CEOs of many companies around the world were much more focused on climate, and technologies were further along than I had suspected. And of course, the economics had changed on renewables, so they were, more attractive with solar and wind and so on. So all of that was a positive. And clearly the public was beginning to move, right? So companies were feeling more pressure from their stakeholders, their shareholders and their employees to do things. So all of these things are beginning to come together. And then TPG just struck me as the perfect platform because, first of all, this was going to be an important part of what TPG does, number one. And that was important to me. Number two, TPG has a culture that emphasizes teamwork and a compensation system that encourages it. So I knew the whole firm would be helpful as we move forward here. And so that was important. I was really attracted to the Y Analytics, the analytical arm that had been set up as part of the Rise Fund, run by Marianne Hancock, where they scrupulously measured impact. And in terms of climate, I thought they were doing it the right way. They weren't focusing on net zero, which is a very, very fuzzy thing. They focused on carbon emissions avoided, right? And so that was something. So every investment was going to be, we can look at, they're going to have to meet a return on capital hurdle and a hurdle in terms of the impact. So that was very important to me. And then lastly, Jim Coulter was extraordinarily important to me because there was no way I was going to agree to be the executive chairman of anything unless we had a very good managing partner. And so the idea was, how could we get a world-class managing partner? And Jim raised his hand. Boy, and then that made it a simple decision. And boy, it's a decision I feel very good about. And in many ways, I've just returned to my roots, in banking and in finance.